Thank you for staying with us until now. And I don't think I've met everyone today. So for those of you I haven't met, I'm Dominic Rassool. I'm part of our client engagement team, and I'm based in Europe. Yeah, we've got a great presentation lined up for you today. And it's going to be about carbon dioxide removals, aka CDR. You've been hearing about it all day, I think. And CDR's set to play a really crucial role in dealing with residual and distributed emissions. And CCS adds a critical sort of element to CDR, and that's permanence. So our next speaker, as I said, has got a great presentation lined up on specifically CDR, and I'm pretty sure he's going to talk about permanence as well. So yeah, I'm really excited to introduce you to Niall McDowell from Imperial College. Niall, over to you.
Thank you, Dominic, and thank you, Jared and Global CCS Institute for the opportunity to speak here today. The key thing is, right, back in sort of 2014, Sabine Fuss and co. assembled this paper, which set against on the y-axis, the amount of CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere, and set that against all of the different temperature outcomes associated with CO2 trajectories over the course of the century. Back in 2015, we were at sort of the mid to high 30s of gigatons of CO2 per year. And in order to get to the sort of Paris Agreement 1.5 degrees target, we needed to be down at this RCP 2.6 blue region, okay? This means that by the second half of the century, we get to net zero, and thereafter pretty substantially net negative. And the two things that are worth kind of thinking about here is today we emit something like 50 billion tons of CO2. So we're definitely not on anything like the blue trajectory. Second, you're looking at removing between 10 and 20 billion tons of CO2 per annum by 2100 in about 80 years. 20 billion is not a million miles away from 50 billion. In other words, the size of the CDR industry that's going to be created, if you believe the models over the course of the next couple of decades, is not that dissimilar to the size of the global economy today. This is big. In 2018, so when people were trying to figure out the ramifications of the Paris Agreement and what 1.5 degrees looks like, they came up with, the IPCC came up with a number of different ways of getting there, and they caricatured them through these four pathways, P1 through P4. The options then you have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, what they call AFOLO, the afforestation or the land use change options, planting trees and so on, and then BECCS, right? Where BECCS is obviously a caricature for all of the other things you can do, because the amount of biomass that you're talking about in P4, for example, is about 16 times planet Earth, right? Now, because of what I just showed you, I think P1 and P2 are essentially not, they're just not really viable, right? We are not in that reality. If we are very lucky, I think in P3, we will have to do quite a lot of this, if not P4, at an extremely large amount. So we definitely need this. The other thing that I've kept coming up against over the course of the last decade or so that I've been thinking about carbon removal is this consistent conflation, either through cynicism or naivete, of carbon removal, carbon avoidance, and carbon utilization. So it's really, really important to clearly distinguish between these concepts. And Andrea Ramirez from TU Delft and also the ZEP have done a really great job of kind of partitioning this on. Peroloff is nodding furiously over there. So this taxonomy thing is really important. And I think this also plays into the kind of emerging legal risk in this space, and we've seen lawsuits already start to emerge. There are a plethora of ways of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. You've got biological routes, chemical routes, you've got different places of putting the CO2. Great paper by Jan Minks and co. a couple of years ago. There was also a book that was published that goes into this in absurd amounts of detail. So, anyone who has, trouble sleeping, please buy the book. The key thing then that I want to get onto that Dom was mentioning, so trees are not the same as rocks, right? The green picture on the left, the cliffs of Dover on the right, both of these are naturally occurring stores of CO2. They are not the same. That's not I don't think, a terribly controversial statement. So we need to therefore understand how can we trade these things? How do we think about them in terms of fungibility with each other? So in that context, the cartoon way that I think about it is, so if you have a permanent sink, a permanent bucket for CO2. Then you may have a sink that's kind of like a predictably leaky bucket, right? So for example, something like biochar might be this. It decays in a predictable way over its lifetime. And then you have unpredictably leaky things. Like, so for example, your forest might randomly decide to burn down, okay? So how do we then value these things in a meaningful way? What I want to do now is very quickly run through the different supply chains, not in any detail, but just to communicate that, with enhanced weathering, you have many steps. They can be energy intensive. What that means is that there are lots of ways for CO2 to leak as a function of the choices that one makes through that supply chain. So, mining, crushing, grinding, transporting rock. I think it's not a controversial statement to say that that can be an energy intensive business. If you do that with fossil fuels in an unabated way, you will leak CO2, right? So you then get into this, how many tons of CO2 are you removing per ton of CO2 you're transferring to a sink? So you can think about this through a concept of carbon removal efficiency, right? And the key thing is that all of these different pathways, biochar, for example, it operates differently. Biochar, you pyrolyze the biomass, you lose unambiguously 50% of the carbon through this process. It then decays and so on. The key thing about biochar is that it's made of different fractions, a labile fraction and a recalcitrant fraction. Labile decays quickly, recalcitrant decays slowly. What that means is, now this gets where it gets kind of important, is that after, say, 1,000 years, the amount of biocarbon or atmospheric carbon that's in that carbon sink is very different to what it might be after 100 years. And the reason that 1,000 and 100 are very important numbers is that Frontier, for example, the Advanced Purchase Group in the US, they want carbon sinks to last 1,000 years. Puro today are more happy with about 100 years, okay? So the value, therefore, of biochar from those different perspectives, very, very different. Direct air capture and storage, everyone, I guess, knows what that is. Magic box that makes everyone's problems go away. The only issue is it's relatively energy intensive, so one might then ask the question, until we reach a very deeply decarbonized energy system, is that the best use of very low carbon or zero carbon energy, given that if you're not in a pretty low carbon energy state, you may not actually be removing CO2 from the atmosphere. People used to talk, so Klaus Lackner, for example, for anyone who remembers him or knows him, used to refer to direct air capture as a kind of an artificial tree. Direct air capture is not the same as a tree. Trees do many, many wonderful things for the environment, right? We get many ecosystem services, including mental health benefits for people who like walking around them. It's not the same. And trying to pretend that all of these different environmental services can be lumped in onto the carbon bucket, I think is kind of disingenuous. And I think that's a real problem as well, because we're seeing a lot of this shoehorning happen. Afforestation, super simple. You go plant trees, it's really easy. Not remotely. This is probably the most complicated thing I've ever had to try and learn about. We were talking about this with some folks from CRH recently. The utility of a hectare of land, of a piece of land, as a means to store carbon really, really varies depending on where in the world you are, the species, but then also the way in which that land sink is managed. So really good management is absolutely key, but it's very efficient. BECCS, bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage, again, the same kinds of things. Key thing here that I want to draw your attention to. So this is a model where we were looking at fiber being harvested from the United States, transported to the UK. The sea transport, you can barely see it in terms of how much carbon you leak. It's actually not that bad. What I really want to get onto, though, Dom, is this issue of permanence, right? So temporary removal doesn't work. When you put fossil CO2 into the atmosphere, it takes about 200,000 years. The geologists apparently have, watched and measured. No, kidding. But so it takes about 200,000 years for the CO2 to decay back into the Earth system. So you can see over the course of the first 100 or 300 years, it's moving from the atmosphere into the fast carbon cycle, so the biosphere, the aquasphere, and then over the second sort of 199,000 years or something like that, slowly into the slow carbon cycle, right? So again, storing CO2 for a century, not completely fungible with not having emitted it in the first place, which is what we're trying to get to with carbon removal. So what we then started thinking about was, well, what's the climate repair value of these different pathways for removing CO2 from the atmosphere? Because the key thing is we definitely need all of them. We're not going to not do something. So how then do we have a way of thinking about this? So again, you can model this with what's called an impulse response function, which captures this slow and fast carbon cycle. And what this then lets us do is make choices. So someone has to make this choice about how long you want the CO2 to be retained in that sink. So this is this 10, 50, 100, et cetera, years across the top. And then you allow for when will that store reverse. So for example, how long do you think this will be stored for? So can we store CO2 in a forest managed for a century, for 2 centuries, for 5 centuries? And if there are any lawyers in the room, who will take those contracts and enforce them and make this really work, right? The key thing is that it's quite nonlinear. So again, if we think about the frontier criteria, where we want 1,000 years of storage, and you store it for 500 years, it only gives you about 0.4, so 40% of the climate repair, okay? So what this now lets us do is start thinking about these things in a kind of fungible way, because this is really important if what we want to do is have a carbon market where carbon removals are fungible with each other in some way, and also fungible with a carbon emission. And I think this is key if eventually we want to have, for example, carbon removal as part of an emissions trading scheme. So what this then gets you to is a place where you can now appropriately compare the price of permanent carbon removal and temporary carbon removal. And the x-axis here is nonlinear, which is why you see this kink after about a century. And if you now think about afforestation, for example, through the lens of wanting 1,000 years of permanence, it actually works out to be quite costly. So too may biochar. Whereas, for example, enhanced weathering or direct air capture even, they can start to look more reasonable in price. So this is a way of trading off these pros and cons. So I'm not going to read this to you, but basically we need an all of the above solution. Permanent removal and the associated monitoring, verification, reporting of those removals, absolutely important. They're not all equivalent, and they're not all equivalently fungible with fossil carbon emissions. And I'm going to leave it there, and Dom, maybe we can have a chat. Thank you.
Are we mic'd up?
Yep.
Okay, great. Ooh. That was excellent.
Thank you.
I won't lie, though, some of this stuff goes over my head. But maybe it's the afternoon. Anyway, great presentation, Niall, and lots of insights and many conclusions. I was particularly sort of drawn to your mentioning of fungibility and of credits and potentially implicitly the convergence of markets.
Yeah.
How does that sort of, away from the science and the theory a bit, how do you see that playing out sort of in the marketplace?
So, okay, so is this, am I working now? Is this right? So the key thing is that people have been trading carbon in some way, shape, or form for about 3 decades, right? You know, through planting trees or avoiding cutting down trees or subsidizing renewable energy. So this concept of paying for carbon is pretty well established. And that's great on the one hand, but it's also challenging because now there's, you know, we think we can get away with paying $5, $10, $20, but then direct air capture seems to want to cost between $500 and $1,000, right? And getting across that sort of hurdle is challenging. So what we need to be able to do is figure out a way of comparing what I call the climate repair value, the service provided by these different paths to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And then also, as you then start scaling up these carbon markets, so you stop having, I will buy something from you directly, but rather I'm trying to participate in a general market in the same way as I might participate in a market to buy oil or copper or steel or whatever. Mm-hmm. You know, a ton of steel is fungible with a ton of steel.
Right.
But today, a ton of removed carbon in a direct air capture process and a ton of removed carbon in a forest, those are not obviously fungible with each other, and I would argue are not equivalently fungible with a fossil carbon emission, right? And so I think that's the piece that we need to solve, and you know, my argument is what we've seen here is one way of maybe doing that.
That makes a lot of sense to me. That sort of brings us then to standards, really, and the role of MRV, you know, especially as you're talking about them not being equal as well. Sort of two-pronged question here, right? So getting CDR to scale up will mean everyone has to agree on the standards and MRV. And there are significant challenges there. But then also we've been seeing in the US, for example, DAC fetching premium prices in the marketplace. And I suppose that's reflective of the value of that high quality permanence credit, right?
Yeah.
What are the implications of MRV and standards and understanding sort of the value of nature-based solutions then versus something like DAC?
Yeah. So we've spoken a lot today about this concept of cross-chain risk, right? So I've captured my CO2 and I pass it to my transport provider and then it goes away. So there is this cross-chain risk. In the same way, this exists if I'm buying an offset. The only thing is I'm going to, instead of capturing it directly, I'm going to pay Jared some money to go and do this for me. But what happens if Jared's service breaks down, right? Or he doesn't do it properly, or something. So then so Galoran has to be, perpetually monitoring and verifying in an independent sense. This providing this MRV function, and then the question is, well, is Galoran going to be watching this forest for the next 7 centuries, or what do we do about the biochar as it decays? So you get into this kind of measure versus model paradigm, and where do we sit in that space? But unambiguously, MRV is on the critical path to any kind of commercialization and inclusion in, for example, an ETS.
Well, that's really interesting, Niall. Maybe one last question before we turn over to the audience. We're in Europe. How sort of far behind are we potentially adopting this sort of approach, let's say? And how are things playing out right now in Europe for CDR?
So obviously the UK is no longer part of the EU, but obviously now His Majesty's government did some pretty fantastic work on carbon removal and MRV and so on quite recently. So I think the UK is thinking about it quite a lot. I think Europe is also thinking about it. The issue is, do you go for something that's wholly separate, so you have separate targeted amounts of CDR, or do you incorporate it with the ETS?
Right.
I think this is a really live discussion, and there is a proposal at the moment from the Commission as to how this might work.
Interesting times.
I think just the key is to not make it too complicated.
Exactly.
One of the nice things about the voluntary carbon market at the moment is, in principle, I would like some carbon removal, you will give me some carbon removal, there's a platform, it's very simple, very straightforward, transactions happen.
It just works.
So let's try and duplicate that.
Excellent. Well, I'm pretty satisfied. How about someone from the audience, maybe? We don't have a lot of time, so your question's got to be good. Go on then. Yeah.
Just talk loudly.
Yeah.
I'm just obviously great presentation. I'm just curious about, maybe you've modeled this already, but when we emit 1 ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, you're talking about this equivalence between a removal and emission. That emission is, once it's in the atmosphere, it's already having an impact. So is that something you've accounted for in your models, or how do we go about kind of rounding that?
Yeah, so yes and yes, right? The question is, how long has it been in the atmosphere before you remove it? And again, so my argument goes something like, the period of harm is about 200,000 years. We've been emitting CO2 for about 100 years. So, of the potential harm, of the total integral of harm, caused harm is not that great relative to what will happen. So it's not that big a deal. So when, for example, you start thinking about Microsoft wanting to pay back all of the CO2 that they have emitted thus far, they basically just need to remove all of the CO2 that they've emitted thus far. The amount of damage that they've done in the last 50 years is not significantly greater than 1, right? So just pay it back. If you were many centuries down the line, that would be a different discussion. The issue that I have is, if you flip that and say, well, we just need to get to 2050, so I just need 30 years of storage, so let's invest heavily in temporary storage, and then in the future miracles will occur because we'll be better people. And I'm deeply uncomfortable with that.
Great question.
So, I think you talking about the permanence of this is the most important thing. It's very important. But the thing for me that I would like to understand more because when we're using engineered removals, the measurement is so straightforward. We have a meter on the pipe, we know how much goes in, and we know that it's very permanent and durable. So my question to you is, the actual calculations for the removals from land-based mechanisms, what is the error even associated with that compared to the error associated with the engineered? And could that play a big part or a small part in how these fungible, mechanisms move forward? And would that be a problem, something we need to think about, or do you think it's just negligible?
So it's definitely not negligible,
Okay.
right? Let's say that there's the MRV of geologically sequestered CO2, where you monitor what goes into the pipe, and then you do your seismic and so on, so you can see how the plume is behaving. That's one set of MRV, and we know, as you say, we can do that pretty well. You can have pretty good confidence with things like enhanced weathering. That's pretty measurable, either in situ, where you've got technology that you embed in the soil and it gives you in situ measurements, or you take soil samples, bring it off to a lab, measure it, and again, you can have that, and that can be very accurate. Other things then, like biochar or soil carbon storage, much more difficult. Then you get into, well, I want to think about the durability of a forest over many centuries. So you can start saying, well, look, today you can use satellite-based measurements, for example, to get a good picture. But going forward in time, what we've done, for example, and imperfectly, is to try and understand the likelihood or the frequency of things like disease, pest, fires, and so on, and how that changes around the world. But of course, so not everywhere is equally likely to kind of have a forest fire. What we haven't done, and what I think could be important, is to then consider, well, what do we think is the likely climate future, and how will that change this? And then after that, so an afforestation project in, I'm trying to think how to say this nicely. There's an exchange rate, right? So depending on where in the world that you do these afforestation projects, you then start to introduce an element of political risk or country risk. So you start stacking these things, right? And so now you've got to think, well, if you're, and I think we talked earlier about brands and taking on that risk. If I'm Global CCS Institute, and I'm going to start buying carbon removal from different places, do I want to take on the country risk as well as, so how do we tackle that? I think these are the challenging questions that we'll need to sort of start to address in a meaningful way. And I think you do that bilaterally, a step at a time.
Any more questions? Maybe I can sneak one in. Oh,
There's
Paul.
Paul.
Hi.
Yeah. Thanks.
Sorry, you were behind the lectern there. I wasn't ignoring you. Yeah.
I just want to know if you could shed some light on, from my benefit at least, your call it the climate repair value. How does that compare to, say, something like ton-year accounting, equally discounting the value of chemical storage over time, trying to put a present-day value on that, which has caused controversy.
Yeah, so I guess the question, just for anyone on the other side, how does the concept that I propose of climate repair value, how does that compare with this concept of ton-year accounting, which basically means you buy, I think, Paul, you buy 10 years of storage, and then in 10 years you come back and you buy another 10 years of storage, and so on out into the future. Is that a reasonable, like this horizontal stacking? Is that
So what ton-year is doing is trying to put a present-day value on the overall benefit of the chemical storage system over a given time frame. So, and it's discounting that value.
Yeah.
So usually you're saying, well, if you store a ton, the actual net climate benefit over 100 years is 0.4 of a ton, and therefore you today you have 0.4. So I think it's doing something similar.
It's very, very similar, yeah. The argument is just to make it as simple as possible, and to, instead of having multiple follow-on contracts, to just have one piece, which you can then start blending. So you could have so many nature-based type solutions blended with so many engineered type solutions to get to a price that you're willing to pay today. Any other questions if we have time? Jared?
So one more, given the complexity of this, right, and that there's clearly much academically rigorous work that's still required to sort of map this out and say, how do you put all these pieces and uncertainty portions together? What are your thoughts on what's the best path forward for this type of conversation in a broader context? And what's the time constant to, at some point in time, get to something that, you know, is sort of a globally fungible, accepted approach?
So I'm not massively convinced that additional academic work is going to be all that useful because, so for example, with what Paul was just mentioning, you know, there are just decisions that need to be made. You know, what's the appropriate discount rate? So I've chosen to use I've chosen not to discount things, right? So, but that's a choice, and that's not no choice I make in an academic context is going to be significant. I think it's much more for the community to take it and run with it and start thinking about these things. But to me, the key issue is planting trees does not meaningfully, in my view, compensate for the emission of fossil carbon to the atmosphere. So let's start exploring that more in a more serious way, more commercially. Attila?
Yeah, thank you. So my question is about whether the dynamic storage capacity might cause some competition in the expected in the near future. And what I mean by that is the Royal Society, for example, calculates that in order to take or remove the carbon dioxide that we need to remove by 2050 and store it underground, we need around 7,000 to 8,000 Sleipner-type wells, which have an injection rate of 1 million tons of CO2. The Climate Action Task Force also projects that by 2030 we might have a shortfall of storage capacity, just because we don't have enough access to the theoretical storage. So are we running into a competition for storage between point source emissions CO2 and atmospheric CO2 that we need to store underground, Professor?
So I think fundamentally that's a stock question. Is there enough, potential CO2 storage available, right? And my understanding, and so I'm not a professor of CO2 storage or geology, but my understanding is that there is an abundance of potential CO2 storage. So really then the answer to your question is it depends what we decide to do, and it depends what policymakers, what project developers decide to do. And if there's a sufficient market, then I think it's totally doable. We just need to decide. I don't think that there's a natural impediment.
Anyone else?
Oh,
Can I just
okay.
comment on that?
Go.
So what we're seeing right now is it doesn't matter the source of the CO2. There's competition among all of the projects, but not because of storage capacity as much as, the easier places to go, the low-hanging storage fruit, the places where it's better for their source to be putting in. But yes, there's competition definitely, but I think it's not necessarily for the reasons that you're stating. At least what we're seeing today.
Any other questions?
Can I just have one last one, Tom?
Yeah.
So in your slides, there was only one that talked about ocean fertilization, but obviously ocean-based CDRs is probably a variant of all things, whether it's trees, rocks, and engineered. And the sea itself, obviously, is a bit like a predictably leaky bucket that you mentioned there. Have you looked at it, and is there a phase? Is it all the same, or is there a phase shift in in the curves that you've shown for ocean-based technologies?
So short answer is I haven't looked at ocean-based things too much. I'm very uneasy about anything that looks and sounds like ocean fertilization, where you're encouraging the growth of algae and things. That worries me a lot. In principle, you can physically remove CO2 from seawater, and either you get a pure CO2 product as you would normally, or you can turn that CO2 into a solid and precipitate it. Those two options, I think, and you get into this discussion of oh yes, but there's so much more CO2 by volume in the ocean than there is in the atmosphere. Well, yes, but the volume of seawater is quite a lot heavier than the equivalent volume of air and so on. Those are not bad. A lot of the other options, I think the MRV could be very challenging, right? So I think you get into, but yeah, you get into lots of different kind of implementation challenges. But I think the general question that I'd raise about, well, you know, how do you measure it? How do you verify it? And how permanent is it? Remains. The general point of removing CO2 from the oceans, I think, is a good one. And if you can do that in a way that doesn't mess with the ecosystems, let's do that.
Just to add a comment, just because particularly there's always a bit of controversy about land usage. Just is there another way?
Yeah, and if we end up going anywhere near 20 billion tons of CO2 removal, per annum, we're going to likely need to do a lot of different things, right? And indeed, there are projects underway in MIT, for example, looking at exactly this. So I do not anticipate that in the year 2100, our solution for removing CO2 from the atmosphere will be sort of burning trees in power stations to make electricity. I mean, that's a bit sort of, yeah. I'd like to think we'd come up with something better.
Well, on that bombshell, I think that's a nice way to end it as well. I dare anyone to come up with something better. But anyway, thank you so much, Niall. I think that was great.